All right, welcome to the 10th workshop on the Freudian Unconscious. This is an ongoing workshop series where we return to the original Freudian texts and attempt to interpret their meanings, both for their historical significance and for the present moment of psychology, psychotherapy, philosophy. In this workshop, we are going to be discussing the relationship between erogenous zones to personal development, as well as the nature of daydreaming and creative writing. Both of the papers we're going to be analyzing are from the late years of the first decade of this century, 1908 to I think they're both 1908, or one is from 1909. And before we get into them, I also want to give a little bit of an overview of some extremely significant events, or not only events, but extremely significant points about Freud's life, which I learned from a recent presentation given at the Freud Museum this past week, which I think will be relevant for reflecting on the nature of psychoanalysis and Freud's own personal character in the development of psychoanalytic theory. So let me share my screen and let's get going. All right, so I'm going to give a start with three interesting points that I took away from the Freud Museum lecture I mentioned. These are just points that were salient to me. They stuck out to me as interesting to think about. The first was that Freud was an obsessional chain smoker. He always had a cigar. He apparently smoked 20 cigars a day. This is just interesting to me, reflecting on my own life with my own relationship with, that similar type of enjoyment. And also, like, the obvious phallic nature of the enjoyment as well. Always having the cigar in his hand, and almost like the idea that in our day-to-day lives, there's a way in which we need, whether that's a cigarette, whether that's a certain type of food, whether that's a certain type of, I don't know, repetitive enjoyment, that there's a certain type of way in which each individual copes with existence and just this reflecting more deeply about the fact that in the 20th century it was like the whole world became addicted to cigarettes and smoking, and what is that form of enjoyment, and how is that manifesting today, and how could it change in the future. The second point I wanted to mention is that Freud introduced a small gap from one bed to two beds with his wife as their marriage developed. Their marriage was always very, supportive, and she was very supportive of him, and from all reports, very loving. But nonetheless, I think that it's very important and symbolical that their bed went from one bed to two beds as the marriage developed. Again, this sort of symbol of the sexual difference, and this symbol of the gap and the impossibility of the sexual relationship. I think this is echoed, of course, in Lacanian theory, and I just think it's interesting for us to think about. And then the third point is that his life was forever changed by an enormous catastrophic rupture. And that enormous catastrophic rupture was being diagnosed with cancer. And I think this is also important to think about, because we should never underestimate the degree to which our lives can be, as it were, just in a moment taken from us. What we think is our life, what we think is our health, what we think of our personality, can just be, as it were, hit by a bus, or you know, just out of the blue changed forever, you know, like this actually happened to my father, you know, getting diagnosed with cancer. And, you know, I also had my own personal experience, for example, when I, not to the same level, but when I got coronavirus, it was kind of like just getting hit by a bus, you know, like, and this can happen to us. And I just think that these 3 points are interesting to think about for, you know, our own lives and Freud as a character. So now let's move on to the seminars for today. The overall theme: character, daydreaming, and the unconscious. The first paper is titled Character and Anal Eroticism from 1908. In this first paper, Freud offers a speculation that the erogenous zones of an organ, the anus, the genitals, the mouth, and so forth, are connected to the development of personal character. In other words, personal character isn't innate from birth. There's, of course, some degree of, you're not born as a blank slate, but nonetheless, there's something about the way in which one experiences enjoyment in the erogenous zones as you're developing as a child, which Freud suspects has a connection to the formation of adult characteristics. So as the case study for this, he focuses on what he calls the anal character. And of course, this is very common today. We call people anal. If someone's anal, what we mean is that they're orderly, they're parsimonious, or they're obstinate. Orderliness meaning they demand cleanliness. They think of themselves as extremely conscientious. This is even in the big 5 personality traits today in psychology: conscientiousness. And they put a high degree of value on being trustworthy. Parsimoniousness is extreme greed, and obstinacy is defiance or rage and revenge. And these clusters of behavior is what Freud labels the anal character. And from his own psychoanalytic material, again, the speech of the neurotics, he offers the speculative possibility that the anal character is connected very deeply to early childhood and the relation the child has to urination and defecation, specifically the holding of and the playing with. I know I have my own memories from childhood, and I'm sure almost every child does to different degrees, but I certainly have my own memories from childhood of the enjoyment that can be manufactured from holding one's stool, to holding one's own capacity to decide when to defecate or not decide when to defecate, or to hold it in, to play with that, and also to find the child's, I remember still the child's mind and the way it can find feces as humorous, the way it can find feces to be funny, comedic thing to play with, as opposed to something to be disgusted by. So this is the type of interesting psychology. I have some funny stories of me and my brother. Me and my brother would do this all the time. We found it endlessly hilarious, different playing with feces. But this is very interesting. So Freud's bringing this to our attention, and he reminds us from his 3 essays on sexuality that the sexual instinct is, of course, not just the normative way we think about the sexual instinct, but in terms of the genital organs of the male and the female being brought together for reproduction and so forth, but that it's a highly complex instinct from childhood that's put together through a multiplicity of drives. This is the polymorphous perversity. The polymorphous perversity. Then the child has the image, this is from Lacan, child has the image of unified omnipotence, and it tries to bring together all the multiplicity of drives. And this is building the adult character. And when you bring together the multiplicity of drives, they're deflected from their original sexual aim. And the original sexual aim is enjoyment, in and for the enjoyment of that erogenous zone. And so this zone becomes deflected from the enjoyment. And how it becomes deflected from the enjoyment is through, he says, reaction formations, counter forces, and labeling them with shame, disgust, different moral prohibitions. And so people, as they become older, as they mature, they start to put shame on their body. What they thought was enjoyable, like, for example, defecation or feces, now becomes disgusting, repugnant, even intolerable, and so forth. And the point of all of these reaction formations and counter forces is to sacrifice excitation of the body for education. There's so much in this process that requires deep reflection. How excitation of the body becomes transferred into demand for education, and how civilization progressively demands this process on the individual. So he makes at first what might seem a strange speculation, which is that there's some relationship between the sublimation of the anal enjoyment with a money complex. That the enjoyment that one used to get from one's capacity to play and hold urination, defecation, becomes sublimated into holding and retaining money. So there's this way in which the anal character, the orderly, parsimonious person, keeps too careful a hold on money and simultaneously thinks it's dirty. So you're holding on, playing with something dirty. And this he describes as a sublimation, and that there's evidence for this sublimation, not just in the behavior of neurotics, but also in the history of our mythological thinking, in the etymology of the words gold, in the etymology of the word money, that in mythological thinking, money is connected to something dirty. It's also something intimate, and that it's also connected to the devil. And he makes the interesting point that the devil could be a personification of the id, the personification of the unconscious drives, and the sublimation of those drives become the reason why money is related to in this way, that it has this devilish, dirty characteristic, and that simultaneously money has the capacity to be the most precious thing and the most worthless thing. And this is interesting. You might remember from Zizek's philosophy that Zizek notes the absolute is something that can go from sublime to grotesque with just a minimal difference. Terence McKenna also referenced the absolute in this way with the difference between shit and shinola, that something can be extremely shiny and something can be, the same thing can turn to shit. This type of strange, you might call it fragile absolute. So this is the final slide. He offers the speculation that we should think about the way in which all character complexes of adults, all personality complexes, are connected to the development of the erogenous zones. In other words, character doesn't just spring out of nothing. Character is something that is built through sublimation. Character is something that's built through the subject's capacity to move with this erotic excitations, the capacity to either express them or deflect them or transform them or substitute them is character. Very interesting. And that the mechanism by which the character emerges is through reaction formations against prohibition or substitution, so forth. And that all of this is the foundational ideas for things that become more deeply explored in civilization and its discontents. We should remember that in civilization and its discontents, the point Freud's making is that there's this tension between the individual drives of what formally are called instincts, but in psychoanalysis we call drive, and demands of civilization. And thinking through this tension today is, I think, extremely important. We're in a different time than Freud. And yeah, so let's talk about it. So please feel free to share any of your thoughts, what might be salient for you. I think, as all Freud's papers for me, I love the way in which they bring to my mind very intimate experiences of my childhood. I remember, again, the way I related to feces, and it's hilarious. So
yeah, the connection to money was quite of like, where did that come from? But ultimately, when you think about it, well, why do we, what is really money when we think about it? Well, why are we jealous of somebody who has a big pile of gold? It's not the metal that's valuable, it's the enjoyment that it brings, right?
exactly.
Money is not really a thing in itself. It's just the thing that's a mediation of enjoyment in a way.
Yes.
And when we are reading Freud, he's bringing our attention to the fact that our enjoyment and our mental economy has to do with fantasies, and always there is a connection between infantile experiences and fantasizing. So I think that there is a clear link that's we can find, but it's really out of nowhere almost. Like
it does in this paper, like that's my impression as well. At first when I read it, it's like the connection springs out of nowhere, and then the more I think about it, the more I find it useful. I don't know, like especially the way in which the etymology and the mythological thinking are connected, and especially in the way in which I view the people who dedicate their life to hoarding money.
Yeah.
The way in which the way they hold the money is totally irrational if I'm not thinking in the Freudian way.
Yeah.
It becomes rational when I'm thinking in this way. But like the way in which, like, for example, there are many people in my life who I know who, in principle, if they didn't have this weird psychical fixation on money, the way they used it and the way they sort of, the way they would use it in their life would be much more practical, much more, pragmatic than it is. It's where the way I see people who hoard money relating to it is almost like almost like a Smeagol in the Lord of the Rings with the Ring of Power.
Yeah.
Like my precious.
There is like regarding this, there is something Zizek comes to mind, something he said about we treat money. We know money is just like a piece of metal, right? We know rationally, but then we treat it as a magical thing. So there is this connection between magical thinking and I reading the text that you suggested for this module, I found this implicit reference to magic without ever mentioning it. Because Freud starts the essay by establishing a difference, no? Right? An opposition between fantasy and reality. But then at the end of the text, of the essay, when he talks about full pleasure, right? There,
I think you're talking about the next paper.
Oh, I'm sorry. I thought we were talking about all of them.
That I'm going to give the presentation on the creative writing and the daydreaming, but that's okay. It's okay. But bring up this point in the next paper, because this distinction between fantasy and reality and the forepleasure is definitely related to sublimation.
Sure. Okay.
A minor point about the relationship with language with gold and shit. So it's still in common usage, you'll say a nugget of shit. Is that familiar to you guys?
Yeah.
I'm trying to think of other connections with everyday language with shit and money, but I don't know. Can anyone think of others?
I was actually thinking the same, because while reading this paper, it made me think of some usual expressions we use here in Morocco. Like to say someone is rich, we usually say he stinks money, he has a lot of money, so much that it stinks. And we call money the shit of the earth, of life on earth. So there are many expressions like this that relates money to the bad smell,
Yeah. And also I cannot but think of some kind of image of a person who is rolling around in money, and you can easily replace money with feces and it's just as enjoyable.
Yeah, like a pig in shit.
Yeah, right? Like a pig in shit.
Yeah. No restrictions. With money or with shit, you have no restrictions. You're the king, boss.
We also talk about capitalist pigs, usually. Yes. The expression goes.
And if somebody is frugal, they're tight with money, that withholding.
Yes. Yeah, that's the behavior I'm trying to point towards with what I've seen with people and money is like the same way that as a child I remember sort of getting an enjoyment holding in my shit. Like if I could hold it in for 5 minutes, there was like a excess pleasure. That's the same way people are frugal, like trying to save a penny. Like I see, for example, the classic example would be older people at the grocery store who are counting out the pennies or something like that. They want to give away the $20 bill. Let's keep the $20 bill for longer. And let me just count out some extra pennies so that I get the exact change. This is it, like holding in the stool,
So the basic philosophical idea would be that the form pertains, the form of the action pertains, but content is irrelevant. Perhaps the content changes, but the form is coming from very early on. And what I was thinking of in thinking about the difference between feces and money is, well, Freud says that in like developing from what he calls latency periods, where sexuality is not that like prevalent until puberty, something from like 5 years old to puberty. What happens is that he says that there are certain reaction formations, counterforces, shame, disgust, and morality.
Yes.
Of course, they are created in the mind at the expense of excitations from erotogenic zones, and give it like dams that oppose the activities for sexual instincts. So in this, there is a qualitative difference in a way, but I think that it's a difference that Hegel would say is no difference in a sense, since it's a line of continuation with a deeper level. So I would say that there is hints at connection between the superego, I think, and id, which I think that Zizek is pointing out over and over again, that there is this idea that id is deeply connected with our superego.
Yes. Yes. And I think the important point you make about Hegel and the dialectic here is really important, because on the level of the process in itself, it's continuous development, but on the level of the subject in itself, it's experienced as ruptures, discontinuities.
Yeah.
Like before and after the genital period, for example. But it's just one continuous process. But there's also this feeling, like, I just want to communicate that this feeling for the subject of a rupture, of a break, is like, I've had many women describe to me that when they get their period, they experience it as a rupture of no going back. Like there's an irreversible break that has happened. Like, and I'd imagine, like, with all of these sort of transformations, especially in the pubertal phase, I maybe even experience masturbation like that, like that masturbation was like okay, there's a difference here, like qualitative difference.
Yeah, something happens and you don't know what it is, but you just have to react and so on. So I can personally really relate to this idea that when sexuality is the most active in like becoming active, I mean, I'm now an adult, it's not so much bothering, but when like experiencing the kind of puberty, it's something mysterious. It causes a break, something that's is perturbing and disturbing, and it doesn't explain itself to you. So the basic like educational project that we can connect to our previous readings is that Freud is thinking in here that if we have a sort of like sexual education for ourselves and sexual education perhaps for children as well, then they may be able to overcome these disturbances in a much healthier way, although there is no getting away from the damages. So perhaps what we can do is educate ourselves and be mindful of the facts that happen within us. I mean, it's this basic idea of perhaps personal development also, that's one educates one's own minds to know what is going to happen in one's life and so on.
Mm-hmm. I really think it's also interesting to focus on the point that you're bringing to our attention, Mika, about, and this also stuck out to me when I was reading, was the way he frames shame, disgust, and morality as created in the mind. Like that that it's almost like he's definitely making a distinction from any sort of, I would say, Platonic model of morality. It's much more developmental, much more grounded in the very becoming of eros.
I would say it's a Nietzschean view,
Yes,
as opposed to
Yes.
Platonic view.
yes, yes. And I would, yeah. And for anyone listening to this after the fact, if you're just starting to read Freud, it's good to couple it with Nietzsche, because
Yeah,
there's definitely
especially I would say Beyond Good and Evil.
yes,
It's really something. I mean, what's the name implying? Beyond Good and Evil. One has to step outside of the traditional morality so that one can really see what it's doing to us.
yeah.
One story related to this. It means that I mean the person, the anal character, is orderly, parsimonious, and obstinate, right? But it doesn't mean that this is because of the sublimation of the anal pleasures that the subject did through the education process. Does this mean that if someone is messy, spending money like there is no tomorrow, or it's easy to manipulate, it means that the something wrong happened in his process of sublimation?
So I wouldn't say I wouldn't phrase it as something went wrong, just that there's a different relation to the enjoyment. Like it's more the way in which the enjoyment is deflected, the way in which the enjoyment is substituted, because he's saying that the enjoyment that so basically saying that it's hard to give up a pleasure that you really enjoy.
Yeah.
So if you really enjoy something and you know that you're going to have to give it up and sacrifice it for something else, it has to be substituted. Something has to replace it. You can't just give it up for nothing. It has to transform into something. So I guess what he would saying, and someone jump in if you have your own views, but what I interpret it as is, if you're a child who gets a particularly strong relation to enjoyment of the anal zone, then I guess what he would say is that you have the tendency within you to become an anal character in your adulthood.
Which is a good thing, right?
It's not a good or bad thing. It's beyond good and evil. It is a thing. It's not good or evil. It is a thing.
Yeah, but I mean,
Like an
we
anal,
all
like
agree.
anal people aren't in themselves good or bad.
I know. But do you think that we all agree that cure is good? I mean, like if I go to a psychologist, or if I go to someone to find support, it's inherently good. That then I feel better, right? So there is at the end a good and a bad thing. I mean, if I go crazy and I start going naked in the street, I have a psychotic crisis. That's not good. That's pathological. Actually, pathological is bad. No, I think this is like otherwise. What is the function of psychoanalysis?
I would like
It
to
will make
jump in
people
on
feel
this.
better, right?
Yeah, Mika, jump in if you want.
Just a short comment. I would like to reflect on the way that we seek help from a psychiatrist for our troubles and the way that we should perhaps see the way that it's cured as non-moralistic in a sense, since if we think that certain character traits of ourselves, like we spend too much money, or perhaps in the extreme case we start to steal telephones from people at the street or something like this, then what's really the kind of cure if we just obey somebody who tells us that it's not good. I mean, wouldn't that be something else than a psychiatric cure? It would be just adopting the kind of ego of this other person, and it wouldn't touch the kind of like core of the problem. And this is why we have to distinguish between the ways that people seek for models, people seek for kind of like ways of behaving, but in psychoanalytic way, they perhaps would seek for the symptom, which is another thing in
The
itself.
what? Sorry.
Symptom, like what Lacan
okay,
says.
Yeah.
But I won't go too much into it right now. But it's a different aim, you know.
Yeah,
That's just something that brings to mind to Lacan. But yeah.
What do we make of this idea that a child withholds shit? So, you know, that idea that I can't remember if it was Freud or Lacan saying that shit is the first gift a child can give their parents other than their birth. So what's the function of withholding it? You know, like there's something interesting going on there, because like I've met people before who can't go to the bathroom in public. They have to return to their house, even if that's a 30-minute drive. It might, you know, completely interrupt their evening, but they must go home in order to do it. Like the privacy involved in it, again, that kind of their relationship to their body, like whether it's an excess that they have to keep or be in charge of or be responsible for, you know, I don't know. What do you guys reckon?
Yeah, it's really interesting. But Freud is saying in the beginning that there are certain people who have this like disposition to become this, and I mean he leaves it very open at what's
Is that true though? Like, sorry, like
it might
wasn't
be,
wasn't Freud saying like specifically that there isn't a disposition, it's that it's a development of character?
I mean the original like tendency to withhold feces. He says that there are certain people who take longer time to overcome infantile incontinence. Like they want to retain the stuff within themselves, and they refuse to relieve it into the pot. So the trouble of all parents who have small children is how to train, how to overcome the potty training. And there are certain people I don't know personally, since I don't have kids, but I know that some kids, like, they have really tough time like giving up the freedom of not having to shit in a pot. And that's what he's pointing towards, that there are like other people who have really a lot of trouble, and they get this surplus enjoyment then from disobeying. And yeah, that's what I was
Yeah,
saying.
cool. And I follow that, because you can also easily imagine a contemporary version of like a hyper-masculine mastery of the body, where you'd have somebody who is so proud of being able to hold on, you know?
Yeah, that's really nice connection.
Sorry for the naive question, but what is the difference between character and subject?
I think that the subject is much more fundamental than the character. The character is like the content of the subject that emerges from development.
Would it be like subject and ego?
Yes, can be more closely related, yeah. To me, the ego is what presents a certain personality, has certain characteristics, whereas the subject can, in principle, can be just a pure void, with devoid of all content.
Can we say like the character is a way the subject relates to the word, or to the object, maybe?
I think like the character, yeah, exactly. The character emerges in these processes, like he's describing, with reaction formations. And these reaction formations have to do with a sort of navigating or adapting to the world. It's kind of like the ego being upheld by the reality principle.
Because people usually talk about character more along the lines of a tendency. So, you know, you demonstrate character over time.
Yeah, you build you build character.
Yeah, it's this idea in personality psychology also. It's relatively like self-sustaining ways of reacting to certain situations that repeat something along these lines. And there are several systems of differentiating between the sides. Like personally, I think that, I mean, I have studied a little bit of personal psychology, and it's basically almost like elaborate astrology for like scientifically minded, you know, like preppy people. But it's just astrology in a way. And I mean because the traits are so like vague. You have say you have 5 characteristics of size, then they are chopped up into smaller pieces, almost like a computer programs, so that they have like these clearly distinguished units. But when you observe people, I mean, it's the origin, the experience of people. I think it's more Freudian than it's along these lines. And when I compare, sorry to
excuse me, go on.
But I think that's the kind of view that Freud has of personality formation. It's a bit more stark and a bit more realistic, and he is saying that personality formation is just this bundle of drives that gets stuck into different like roots. And he's saying it's a beautiful quote. I think the permanent character traits are either unchanged prolongations of the original drives, or sublimations of those drives, or reaction formations against them. I think it's really good formation of
Totally.
I think that it's worth here connecting what we're talking about here with the sort of speculative conclusion at the end of the paper about how general character complexes are connected to the maturation and the expression of the erogenous zones. And like here, I'm thinking about the way in which an adult's capacity to get a type of sexual enjoyment from certain erogenous zones really often is connected to the appearance of certain archetypal figures, like, I don't know, like the jock, or the I don't know, the prom queen, or the classical ridiculous figures, but also like figures like, for example, look at the incels. Like the incels are having a certain character, and that's emerging from a certain grievance of erogenous zone satisfaction.
Yeah, that's great.
There is like a question, like you know, you have like it seems that there are these erogenous zones, right? The anus, the mouth, the lips, the breath. We know them, but is it possible to create new erogenous zones, right?
Yes.
Where the game starts to become very interesting, right? Because I read recently a book that is a masterpiece, a sex appeal of the inorganic by Perniola, this philosopher, and he is all the description of him becoming a thing that feels, and the development of a new eroticism based on being a thing. And you know, reading these pages, which is like pure philosophy, but you really aroused me. And I started thinking, oh my God, how can I start experiencing this shit? And I really, I related this with what you, Cadell, said recently in some of your interviews, of your conferences, about developing this relationship with the alien, right? Erotically, no? But I always thought, is this alien someone that is really like outside, or basically we are all aliens, no? Like the concept of extimité, no? That private thing.
Extimate.
Extimate. Yes, exactly.
It's
no?
not, it's
Because
not
the
so much,
alien- we
the
are the
reason
alien.
why, the reason why I love the word extimate, because it communicates an externality which is internal.
Exactly. It's more
That's
private.
the beautiful.
Yeah. And I mean, I'm very interested in this, and I wonder if you are open to share with us, like really how concretely is working for you. I mean, like I can talk also about my experience. I find it very difficult. I think is the real challenge, right? To change the erogenous zone is really to change the subject.
I agree. I agree. I think that's more and more what I even think that's why I have this sort of unconscious drive to try to connect, or at least it appeals to me, the connecting between yogic philosophy and psychoanalysis, because yogic philosophy plays with the body in a way where it's playing with the drives. It's not trying to shut them down. It's trying to cultivate a deeper relationship with the drives. And I think that because we cannot just give up a certain satisfaction, it has to be substituted for something more intense. I think that this is the type of thing that I'm exploring, for example, in dynamic meditation. In dynamic meditation, I am trying to get a certain, I would say, penile satisfaction, but a penile satisfaction that is brought to my mind, to bring it up, almost to turn myself into an erection.
So your brain, you are making your brain an erogenous zone. Is that what you're saying?
I'm trying to turn my entire body into a penile excitation.
Oh, that sounds like a
Cadell,
Cronenberg movie. That sounds like a Cronenberg movie.
you mentioned the other day of like one of these Return to Freud's, Cadell, about some yogi type guy exercising or like invigorating his whole body, almost like a complete body masturbation or something like that, right? So the skin is the largest organ that we have.
Exactly.
And I was thinking, like, before when Mako was talking, the manner in which he speaks when he's like in the zone is very reminiscent of like a young Bob Dylan in interviews and that kind of thing, when he's like,
oh my God,
vibrating at this intensity. And you know, there's something to be said for that kind of thing, because like one of the most profound things I'm experiencing with going back and reading through Freud is just how open the body is. Like the fellow earlier who was talking about like different erogenous zones, like the idea is like really that it is open from the beginning. The body, like any part of your body, can become an erotogenic zone. And it, you know, like at the end of this essay, when Freud's talking about, I'm not sure if I'm going to pronounce it right, but enuresis. At the end of this essay, he says, at present, I only know of the intense burning, in quotations, ambition of people who earlier suffered from enuresis, which is the involuntary urination, right? Because in this Freud biography that I was reading, he recounts, it's in Interpretation of Dreams, but he recounts going into his parents' bedroom when they're having sex and he wets himself. So there's this distinct connection here with that, like excitation of particular erotogenic zones. And again, to link it to that money, that concept of like giving away. What is Freud giving away in that moment, in that release? Like, because I mean, I'm sure traditionally the reading would be it's sexual excitation, right? But it's open to more than that, I think. But it's interesting.
Yeah, that's a really, really nice comment, I think. Yeah, also the overall picture of like human sexuality, it's really, really like, it's tremendously helpful for our current science.
Yeah, also Zizek talks about this, about how going beyond humanity is going beyond sexual reproduction, right? It's changing the sexual reproduction like he talks about singularity, falling into singularity, where actually it's changing like our way how we enjoy sex also. So it's that is like maybe a variation of what you were saying before, like you turning into yogi philosophical, like that's an option. Like there is also performance art, for example, right?
Absolutely.
Like contemporary art,
Yeah.
where they just like disembody, like they open their body, the body performance, right? When they do all the sort of things with their body, they put the like bones in the head, or they create. Did you see those things on the penis? They make some incredible things in the penis. They divide the penis in two like that. I saw some photos that are really terrible. So there is all these like practices of dismantling the erogenous map of the body through this extreme artistic performance. So this is also another option. But the third option, it could be also a technological one, as the one that Zizek describes through singularity. All these examples are pertaining to the sexual and erogenous zones of the body and changing. It's really a deep process that could really turn yourself into something else,
Yeah, it's related to how our drives are organized, and something that I was thinking about all the time when this topic was brought up was, isn't the kind of like ordinary like approach to language that it's posing an obstacle to our direct enjoyment? I mean, the way that I see some kind of like ordinary academic like discussing how language limits or how language must not disturb or something like this along these lines, isn't the way that Lacan is formulating Freudianism, intending to show that even our language can be sexualized. It can become a sexual organ in a twisted sense, since I mean, in previous papers, Freud was discussing about how like difficult it is to sublimate, and it requires a lot of strength, and it requires, but basically the idea is that it can happen that even our like use of language becomes sexualized, and the connection to yogic and what distinguishes this view is that, I mean, isn't the kind of like Asian view of what's the end goal, what's the point where you are free? The point is where language no longer bothers your mind. I mean, the yogic philosophers and the Buddhists, they are saying that doubt and thinking is something that you need to overcome, and they need to do it with certain exercise and so on. But isn't it quite like naive in a sense, since they don't recognize what language is doing already? Like it's providing this kind of, and I think that this really connects to our next paper, since it's getting discussed. But I was thinking about this example of how language gets sexualized, which I think it's genius. It's coming from Zizek. It's this like self-culpabilization that the politically correct left does. Mm-hmm. I mean, they get enormous enjoyments out of like making themselves culpable for every kinds of like all like everything that's gone wrong in like third world. It's all due to the white man's pride, and this kind of like making oneself culpable for everything. It's something that's happening in language, and it brings this mergenus, as Zizek says in many times.
Yeah, Cadell, I am skeptical a bit the yogi philosophy, that a bit but like, because why? Because I think Nika, right? Because it's totally right, about this, because I think it's naive a bit, the conception. I have to say that I'm not so much into yogi, but let me 1 second, just one thing. Like, it's like that the language is seen as an obstacle in the sense to the enjoyment. Instead, in Lacan and Freud, they see, yes, it is an obstacle, but the desire is rising from this obstacle. So it's not an antagonist. It's exactly what makes the desire what it is. So you don't have to fight language, because there is this wonderful metaphor of, that describes how it's impossible to get out of language. You know, it's like we are like a fly inside a glass cover, you know,
like a Klein bottle.
and we always we think that we see the world because the glass is transparent, but if we want to go into the world, we are always closed by the glass. So this tradition, no, that tells you meditation is going beyond language, is going beyond the symbolic, it's reaching that, it's all, for me, it's all bullshit, you know. What you reach is not the beyond of language, but it's the language itself. It's the being of language. It's the which is, you can't go beyond it. And that's, I think, is it's what Nika was saying about this, you know, like, yeah.
Yeah, it's a deep
Okay.
problematic. Yeah, it's really, yeah.
Okay, there's lots of interesting things to say here, but not enough time. My only thing that I want to say is that whenever I'm bringing in like, for example, trying to put yogic philosophy into conversation with psychoanalysis, I'm not identifying with yogis, or I'm not identifying with their total metaphysics or something, merely interested, merely exploring possible connections and so forth. And the idea that you can go beyond language or get out of language totally, I think is absolutely wrong and misleading, which is why I don't like the Buddhist sort of approach to meditation and enlightenment and so forth. Like, it's a big topic.
Yeah.
And the way you're describing it is precise. So I think that that's really beautiful and really great for the viewers. But it is time, I think, to go to the next paper.
Sure.
So let's go to the next paper. And when we're going over this, David, remember what you were talking about for pleasure and fantasy and reality, because this is the paper for that.
Mm-hmm.
Let me just share my screen.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. So the second paper is titled Creative Writers and Daydreaming, also from 1908. He notes that the creative writer is a strange being, and he suggests that the strangeness of the being is that the creative writer creates a distance between himself and the common run of humanity, and yet assures us that at the core of every man's heart is a poet. So there's this distantiation, this separation from common humanity, and at the same time, a claim to something central to humanity, which is this poetic expression. Freud connects this idea to the idea that in childhood, all children are in some sense playing as if they're creative writers. That in the heart of every child, they create their own world and they rearrange the world as it pleases them in their imagination, in their writing, in their drawing, in their fantasizing with toys. And that the child takes play seriously, that the child creates a reality of play, which is serious, which is distinct from its normal reality. And he suggests here that the creative writer merely extends this childhood behavior into adulthood. And that there's an enormous amount of emotional investment. It's an outlet for the emotions, and that in principle, the only difference between the common run of humanity and the poet at the heart is the capacity to maintain this into adulthood. He then informs us, as we all know, that adults grow up, adults cease to play, And the reason why they stop playing is because they have to deal with the realities of life. They have to sacrifice their pleasure, and that this is the hardest thing to do. But you cannot get rid of it entirely. As we've talked about in the previous paper, it has to be substituted. There has to be a surrogate for this pleasure which was sacrificed. And how this is sacrificed in adults is their fantasies, their daydreams. He calls them castles in the air. I have to mention that in my interaction with many professors and many university academics, I find that many of their theories are adult fantasies, castles in the air. And so we have to think deeper about how this childhood play becomes maintained into adulthood in very strange, sneaky ways. Interesting thing, obviously, from psychoanalysis is that in psychoanalysis, we observe what most people never can observe about the other, meaning that we observe the adult fantasies themselves. We observe what people hide from others. We observe what is inherently difficult to observe. We observe fantasies that people are normally ashamed by, fantasies that people feel are impermissible, not capable to be expressed. If they would express them, they think that their entire symbolic universe would fall apart. They think that if they were to express their fantasies, they would no longer be integrated into the symbolic order. They're the most intimate fantasies, and this is the material of the analysis. So the difference Freud makes, which is similar to the difference he observes in his theory of dreams, which is that a child does not conceal his dreams. A child has yet to repress his dreams. A child expresses his wish and always expresses the wish to be a grown-up. Now, neurotic adults are forced because of their condition to reveal and share their fantasies because they can no longer function within the given symbolic order. And the fantasy that they share is always expressing the same motive, which is that their wishes were destroyed, their wishes were unsatisfied, that their neurotic obsession is a type of attempt to correct reality, to correct for a disturbing, horrible, tragic reality. And that's why their fantasy is so intimate, so precious. He then suggests that there are two main groups of fantasies, and he sexuates them clearly, but I think that in the 21st century, it becomes much easier to see them as androgynous and that men and women both have these fantasies, which is the erotic and the ambitious fantasies. He suggests that young women are possessed by erotic fantasies of being possessed, of being owned, of being the one, whereas men have ambitious fantasies. They have fantasies of being the hero, of being the savior, of being the guru, of being the king, of being the one who gets the woman. Here, my favorite idea is think about the structure of Super Mario. He overcomes all the obstacles to get the princess in the castle. This is the man's naive fantasies. And that the woman represses her desires to be owned, woman represses her desires, her erotic fantasies, because of moral prohibitions. And men also repress their, and not all men do this, and some men do it very poorly. Men repress their desire for excess self-regard, because every man wants to be the king. Every man wants to be the center of the throne. And they have to repress this desire. Whereas Freud suggests the creative writer is the dreamer in broad daylight. The creative writer simulates, and I think this is a beautiful formulation of the creative writer, simulates a feeling of security while on an adventure. He solves a fundamental problem of the drive to both be secure and an adventure. Because when we go on an adventure, we're not secure. And when we're secure, we're not on an adventure. So the creative writer brings the two together. We get security and we can go on an adventure. And this is also achieved in video games like Super Mario, because you can die in Super Mario, but it's okay. You're secure because you'll just be reborn. So you can still go on the adventure. So there's this feeling that subjectivity gains of nothing can happen to me. He says, quote, His Majesty the ego. So the hero is typically, in these erotic fantasies, invulnerable, cannot be destroyed, immortal, and noble. Whereas the woman is the object of desire, is the prize, and all women want to be owned by the hero. So his idea here, and this is an interesting theory, he basically develops a theory of the creative writer and suggests that a strong experience in the present moment of the adult creative writer could happen to you this moment, could happen to you right now, awakens a memory complex from infancy, which expresses itself in the creative writing activity. Could be any type of contingent experience in the present moment, could totally reflect the contingency of the present moment, but nonetheless is reawakening something primal, something of the deepest intimacy. So this theory, he suggests, could have some usefulness for neurotics, because neurotics start to suffer when their fantasies become too strong for their symbolic order. When their fantasies are so strong that they have to be repressed so deeply that they need to go to analysis. They submit themselves to analysis. And here's the problem, is that when a neurotic openly discloses his fantasies, other people are repelled. Other people are cold because they don't care, because they don't want to hear about his or her fantasies, and they have no time or capacity to entertain his fantasies. So the creative writer is, Freud thinks, a natural solution. That the solution is, if you take your neurotic fantasies and you sublimate them into art, that not only does the artist experience a great pleasure, an inner, he says, the writer achieves a, quote, innermost secret, that one can liberate the tensions of the mind and enjoy the fantasies without shame. So not only does one enjoy one's own deepest fantasies in the expression of the art, but also others potentially are open to them, are also capable of enjoying. So very interesting. I'm going to stop sharing now. I have many interesting connections again with these ideas in my own life, because when I was a child, I would have boxes and boxes of creative writing and creative drawing just naturally coming out. And all of that stopped when I had to focus more and more on school education. But nonetheless, I see it come out of me in interesting ways. And I also see the way in which my own neurotic fantasies are stimulated in the present moment, but nonetheless, they form a story which is reflecting this feeling of absolute security and absolute adventure at the same time. And even when I, for example, when I get an enjoyment from video game subjectivity, and this is a point Zizek makes about video game subjectivity. Video game subjectivity is interesting in the sense that it's undead, immortal subjectivity. Because you can die and die again better. He calls it an obscene immortality.
It's interesting, like when you think about something like going to Disneyland or an adventure park type of thing, where you have a say for, what was the expression? You said something and adventure. What was it again?
Security and adventure.
Security and adventure, right? So like you go on the big scary ride, knowing all the while that you're completely within parameters that have been overlooked at every single moment, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And there's that Baudrillard went to Disneyland, like he went to America, went to Disneyland for the first time, and a bunch of journalists followed him. And it was only when they went to the car park of Disneyland that he got the most excited. And he was looking out on the expanse of cars and whatnot, and was like, oh my God, now they think that they have exceeded the parameters of ideology, but this is where Disneyland truly begins, like that exit. So you have your experience of adventure, and yet not at all.
Mm. That's really interesting now to think about how much enjoyment is derived from going on a roller coaster, or I remember.
Think of what, like the ultimate one, I reckon, is like the African safari. Yeah. When you're in that like exposed chamber of the, I don't know what you would call it, like a, what's the back of, like a trailer, ostensibly, right? And then you see a rhino or some like terrifying predator or whatever, and you get to have the thrill of being close, and the terror is our guide able to shoot that animal before it gets to us, or have we tricked ourselves and enjoyed the trick of being in a wildlife park? How true is the danger? Like, to what extent, which part are we fetishizing? The park, the animal, the guide, like that type of enjoyment.
Absolutely. This, I also know some people who get an extreme enjoyment from horror movies where they're going to be all of a sudden surprised by the killer, like that, almost like you're simulating the feeling of being killed, but you know you're safe because you're just watching a movie. You're simulating this feeling of approaching death, and there's an excitation with this approaching death, which we're simultaneously need to be avoiding at all costs and drawn to at the same time.
Cinema is a great example because, you know, like everyone's had this experience where you'll have someone in the movies go, leave the fucking house, bitch. Or like, call the, you know, like there's some interruption.
Take it.
Yeah, because that is the sign that it is a simulation. Yeah, like some experience of preparedness or yeah, definitely full libidinal investment.
Yeah.
Why you understand that is a sublimation, a simulation? Sorry, when this happens in the movie.
In the simple sense of simulating the possibility of it occurring. So not in a psychoanalytical sense.
Oh, okay.
I was just thinking, is there something of the same going on in like the sense of security and expansion at the same time? Like in a concert, for example, or in group, or like in fascism, where you can
Absolutely.
you can dissolve and you can be secure at the same time.
I was just thinking that I get that feeling when I went to my first psychedelic ceremony. In my first psychedelic ceremony, I was with a group. We were in a secure setting, and in a psychedelic ceremony, they always emphasize set and setting for security. But then that's a launch pad for adventure.
So we can perhaps read Freud as in this paper, like trying to approach certain mechanisms which are at play when we experience pleasure from fiction, but perhaps also from other kinds of things. And I think that this is really interesting, and he does make a good formula out of this type of like way that we gain pleasure from realizing certain fantasies which repeat in stories and other actions as well. But I would say that I'm personally quite dissatisfied with the picture of creative work that he is focusing on, since Freud seems to be limiting his view. I mean, he's explicit also in the end about focusing on the kind of like creative work where it begins from some kind of like fantasy or daydream which the creative person has. And in this, I would connect his view to a romantic view of the artist. I mean, the romantic view which emerges from 18th century, and he's distinguishing it from the classical view where the tradition is ordering the way that you have to do it. So, I mean, the classical like writer was not somebody who was creative person. The classical writer was somebody who obeyed the traditions, the strictures of how you order your poems so that they fit the technique that's prevalent. And I mean, the very word of author, it's coming from connection to word author, which is auctoritas, authority. It relates to the kind of the authority of the whole like paradigm. And what Freud is focusing on is certain like romantic view which sees the creative imagination and the inner creative like foundation as some kind of like basis of writing itself. And this I find quite dissatisfying, since it's keeping us from having a good definition of literature in itself in a way in modern times. I mean, the romantic view is that the writer is in certain sense really the key of the work, and Freud is also this interest in the way that the life of the writer is written into the work. And before this kind of like romantic view, the writer was just this kind of like poeta doctus who knew everything about the tradition and was perfectly fluent in every technique that was available and knew everything about traditions. I mean, this was the previous view, but yeah. So I would say that in modern times we no longer have this kind of like romantic view. Romantic view is also responsible for introducing the kind of concept of genius, of artistic genius. It's a romantic concept, and I think that we have, in a sense, overcome it in modern literature, since modern literature is something that's breaking every convention that's available and using everything, and it's almost like writing becomes this fragmented field of drives where there are just partial formations which start and end. And in this I am thinking about, for example, James Joyce's Finnegan's Wake, which is one of my favorites. It's just this kind of like mishmash of every kind of idea that comes along, and there's no coherence, there's no story. I mean, I'm really like, it's really clear why somebody like Lacan would be fascinated about the work. I could go on more about this point, but yeah, basically I find it quite dissatisfying in a sense to just focus on the creative imagination.
Yeah, please maybe offer a certain perspective on how Finnegan's Wake and Lacan's interest in Joyce sort of contradicts or somehow breaks this paper by Freud.
Yeah. It's clear to me that Joyce is very intentional in Joyce's writing, that he is adamantly not following any kind of convention of how do you place a dot in a sentence, how do you use language in a sense. He's breaking the whole model of creativity, and the way that Joyce is saying what's his program. He's trying to make every critic and reader busy for the next, I don't know, 300 years or something like this. And Lacan's interest is in Joyce's work, since he sees a symptom formation. I mean, Lacan is saying that Joyce was somebody who tried to overcome his mental illness by writing. I mean, Lacan is saying, this is cryptic, I know, but the link between imaginary and link between symbolic to the real gets sort of like detached or dissembled in Joyce's mental life. So what Freud is speaking of as a creative writer is focusing on somebody who just creates something imaginative. He's not talking about somebody like Joyce, who is mentally deranged in a sense and has a troubling childhood which all the time haunts. And I think that modern literature is more on the side of Joyce, since it is in a way literature of trauma or of subjectivity in the unconscious sense. And Lacan is in Joyce finding a way that Joyce is trying to amend the kind of like dissolution of the registers by introducing a symptom, which is a link between them, a fourth like member of the series.
Can I say something about this that is really on topic? Because I agree totally with what you just said, that it's a bit limiting, and it's a bit like not close to our reality somehow, this description. But why? Because it separates this between fantasy and reality, no? So you are dealing in fantasy, you are not dealing with reality. But I think this is not, if you go until the end of the text, at the end, when he talks about full pleasures, right? This is very Lacanian thing. because in the full pleasure, it's really impossible to separate fantasy and reality. The two things in the full pleasures just like enter into this dimension of reality and fantasy, and that's exactly the real, right? That's the real with a capital R, which is like the Lacanian concept. So I agree with you, but I also think that it's there are some elements that are instead very contemporary. And by making an example, the other day I've seen this movie of Fincher, Gone Girl, okay, where he describes this character as a psychopath. It's basically a psychopath, okay? And it's so interesting the way how the psychopath is entering into this discourse, because the psychopath is treating reality as a fantasy. So he's living his life, the real, for him, is like a stage. The other persons that he's dealing with, they are simply puppets, okay? They are roles. This is the vision of the psychopath. And so why is interesting? Because he's experiencing the reality as a fiction. So it's a way how you can collapse this difference between reality and fantasy.
Yeah. I get the point. Yeah.
I think that the same thing can go for Duchamp, the urinatory, and this connects with the shit before, right? He puts the urinatory in the gallery. Okay. Yeah. Also, this is a collapse of the difference. And
yeah. I'm sorry to interrupt, but I'm trying to keep the kind of topic that I was proposing here as activists. I was perhaps interested in a slightly different senses. You seem to be focusing on kind of theoretical distinction between categories, and I was pointing out that something that Freud doesn't see, since this is not perhaps even that prevalent in his time, is that people who have mental illness or mental health problems, they are usually people also who try to overcome it with their own creative works. I mean, it is recognized by Freud, but he doesn't see people as in their creative writing trying to create some kind of like substitute therapy for themselves, like trying to overcome a mental health illness by immersing themselves into a creative writing. So I could perhaps go on a bit about myself. I mean, I have had a period in my life where I was really depressed and lonely, and then I tried fully like immerse myself into writing. I mean, I wrote almost like all the time when I was awake. I was just writing. I consumed all pencils that I had. Like I had to go and buy a set of pencils and continue just writing. And what I was trying to dig out was some kind of like substitute therapy for the kind of issue that I was going through. And I would say that it's something that's, I mean, there's really a big institution for this kind of like therapeutic writings, where people try to like describe their own mental illness to somebody who just needs to hear about it. I mean, the person who is writing about their own mental illness, they have this picture of somebody who really needs to learn or really needs to hear some big other, I would say, in the end.
Almost a way of cheating then.
Mika, do you think that shift in understanding about like the romantic relationship to art? So when Freud was talking about it, I fully agreed with your formulation there. But regarding the last part that you were talking about, to use a contemporary example, something like Daniel Johnston, where people would consider him some kind of romantic or tragic figure based purely around his relationship to art via a mental illness. Does that make sense to you?
Yeah, definitely. Well,
So
the kind of like distinction that I'm trying to point out is that there is this, Freud is focusing on the aesthetic function of writing. It's this projection of this aesthetic edifice, but there's also the kind of like knowledge aspect, which is really important for the people who are trying to make like some kind of like autobiographical depiction of their own mental illness. And it's really common that when people do not have available therapy, they try to just write themselves out of it. And that's what I see in Joyce also. It's just this appropriation of a technique, trying to use some technique or like method.
I don't understand why you see this in Freud. You say that you don't see this in Freud. I totally see this in Freud. He's saying these things. He's saying that the creative writer is dealing with his personal sublimation, with his with all the so it's a way how he cope with that, and he's a genius actually, because he find a way how he can survive and maintain his enjoyment, right? So it's the smartest choice basically to develop this dimension and to create this dimension. I think it's health. I think really it's so I don't understand why you don't see this thing in Freud. I think the entire text is about this.
Well, perhaps I would just briefly say that Freud didn't have access to James Joyce. That's what I'm trying to say. I mean, he didn't know that kind of like writing was available even.
I definitely also see in this paper that he is connecting the capacity of the creative writer to openly daydream to some sort of, to me, he's just not using the word symptom, but he's not using the Lacanian jargon, but he's pointing in the same direction.
Totally.
Do you see him at pointing in the same direction, Mika, or do you see?
Not exactly, no. Since I think that Freud takes as a starting point, and he even brings this as an opposition to the classical view of the artist as some sort of like dependent and inessential person in face of tradition, since he says that it's all springing from the creative imagination and daydreams. I mean, the whole point of the paper is to bring together the creative imagination and the creative work, fantasy and work.
The way I interpret the two different artists, tell me if you think I'm off. The way I interpret the two different artists is take for example, like you're saying, the traditional artists, like someone like Michelangelo having to express his art through the big other of the religion and the state power, that he's in service of the state power and the wish of the state power. Whereas the modern writer is someone who is connecting to their own singularity, their own wish. And so it kind of flips the big other into the non-other within.
Kind of, but I would say that it's not the modernist, but it's the romantic who Freud is focusing on, who takes inner genius as some kind of like authority instead of the tradition. And the modernist writer is something that Freud doesn't recognize.
I see what you're saying now. So there's on the one hand, there's the artist held by the traditional authority. On the other hand, there's the writer who's held by the personal fantasy.
Yeah.
And then there's a third.
Yeah, and Freud doesn't recognize that, and he focuses on the mechanism by which the fulfillment of fantasy is at play in writing.
And you think that this third element is symbolized by Joyce as someone who breaks the very creative mold itself that
Yeah.
experiments with all sorts of different mediums, narratives, ways of representing.
Yeah, it's trying to get to the level of drive, that pure fragmentation of everything.
And didn't Joyce actually say like his intention was genuinely to disrupt with Finnegan's Wake? He was like, Dubliners didn't sell, nobody liked my work. I'm going to deliberately go against these conventions, take the rules and conventions of this discourse and see how far I can trouble them and problematize them, go through.
Yeah, and it's really interesting how far one can take it. Like, if you start breaking up all the conventions of language and mind, it is bringing into surface things that perhaps weren't available.
Because the common criticism always with that type of pursuit is you need to know how to paint the bowl of fruit before you abstract it, right? Like that's usually the criticism that people have about that type of technique. So with someone like Joyce, you know, the amount of work prior to Finnegan's Wake allows for the surplus of his work, right? Like this is what was produced at that point for Finnegan's Wake.
You have to go through that process, I think. Like, for example, the classic example I think of is Picasso, because Picasso could draw a classical piece of art better than any classical artist, but he had to learn how to do that. He had to go through that before he revisited the more eccentric type of art which broke the mold.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And like I was reading about Picasso a couple of weeks ago, and it was when the tanks first came into the province and he saw the camouflage paint on the tanks themselves, he had this terrifying moment of, we did that. Like, as artists, this modernist movement of abstraction, we created the possibility for camouflage, the reduction of an image to its constituent elements on the tank as camouflage. So it's like the formulation I have for it is first as painting, then as panzer.
What's that?
Yeah.
Panzer?
First as painting and then as panzer, panzer being like the name of a tank. This camouflage tank moving its way through the town, seeing that because it hadn't happened before. This distribution of color in this way hadn't happened prior to this break in art with modernism.
Yes,
that's amazing.
There's the way in which art, and this is mentioned in Zizek a lot, I think. There's a way in which a genuinely new piece of art forever changes the whole way we interpret the past of art. That something emerges which contingently emerges, but once it emerges, it sort of necessarily orders the whole.
All those symbolic elements, yeah.
There is like
perfect. So like the truth of cubism is art at war. That's my formulation for it.
Okay.
There is like Badiou that talks about this related to Monet, the painter, French painter that paints. That for the Badiou, the art is the inscription of an impossibility, you know, because it's an attempt to capture something, and this attempt is already from the beginning impossible, but nevertheless you do it. So for example, in Monet paintings, that he tries to capture the infinite fragmentation of light, no? How light is dividing itself in the water, no? In this drawing, and it's impossible, right? Because how can you capture that with a painting, no? But nevertheless, he does it, and in this attempt, he is like capturing an impossibility and make it possible. So like that is establishing a new frame of rules, because it's there. It's a materialized impossibility, and this is I think it's the same process Mika is describing. Now I got what he wanted to say. In Joyce, right? There is this third figure of a kind of a psychotic writer, which is like it is very interesting, like this thing.
Yeah. It's something that I also find in Hegel. I mean, Hegel also is stuck in a way in the romantic view of literature in his lectures on aesthetics, on philosophy of art.
Regarding this, do you think it's possible to say that the psychotic or the psychopath is like a potential writer, a potential creative writer? I mean, the relation between the psychopath and the creative writer, it could be the same that we find between the hysterical and the pervert, as if the psychopath is a perverted writer that enacts the fantasies of the creative writer. I don't know.
I couldn't say, since I don't know the categorization well enough to do that, but in a sense, one has to be crazy to start writing something in modernist way.
No, in a way, like if you imagine you are a therapist and you get like a psychopath in your studio, maybe a way how you can deal with it is like, why don't you turn your fantasies into writing so that you are hysterized yourself, you know? So as if like the writer is an hysterical psychopath.
I love that. I think that's really cool. What do you think is, if we were to compare daydreaming to normal dreaming, what do you think are the significant differences? Like, why is it that daydreaming allows for this kind of creative affect compared to, for lack of a better description, night dreaming?
Well, night dreaming is, the main difference is the level of unconscious censorship. Because unless you're capable of lucid dreaming, then what you're wishing is unconscious and distorted to you. Whereas in daydreaming, there's the possibility to consciously go into it and to, as it were, I've seen this in myself, the more I go into my daydreams, is the possibility for you to actively destroy all of the frame which would prohibit your exploration.
I find it hard to conceive of where the unconscious limit is for a daydream. So like, I understand how night dreams function and the role of the unconscious in a night dream. In a daydream, I understand that you have mechanisms of repression, etc., going on, but then you also have this a kind of freedom that you have in relation to the repression as it's happening. As a subject, there is some type of feedback where you're able to interact with repression, but the unconscious is still functioning the same way, right? Like, it's not like during the day. I know that Freud says that there's less, it's quite like
Censorship.
Yeah, less censorship, but, and then he has to use examples like the night watchman or the guard or whatever, like,
yeah,
because he has to, he's in a position where he has to use poetic language to explain it. So it gets a little bit vague, I suppose, right? So in a daydream, I do understand, experientially, I totally understand what it is like to have a daydream and relate to repression. But what is that relationship and why is it special compared to a night dream? Like what's happening there that is interesting for Freud, for creation or for creativity? Is it the reflexivity? Is it the space for freedom for like a creative act? And if it is, I think it has to be some type of feedback loop. Is me taking a stab in the dark for a description, but I'm putting up to the group.
Connecting this, perhaps an example of somebody who really does work with daydreams is one of my definite favorites, namely David Lynch. I mean, he describes how he tries to like fish for ideas. He tries to capture ideas, and in this he utilizes daydreaming, and he has apparently had this like a practice where he sits alone in dark in like a chair, just chain smokes cigarettes and drinks red wine and tries to fish for ideas, and then he starts to working with those ideas. And I think that this is something that's all creative workers have to do in a sense, but
I love
in their own
that.
fashion.
But Lynch has to pay for his particular mantra that he has to repeat for transcendental meditation. It's like such a creepy version of this type of capitalist meditation where you have to pay for a particular mantra. Do you know this with transcendental meditation?
Yeah.
That's the David Lynch thing. Like Miko, I've read or listened to the fishing for ideas. That's my David Lynch impression. And I, like I've had experiences like that, or at the very least, like can relate to that idea of kind of slowing your thoughts down, being in the moment, trying to allow images and ideas to flow past your subjective experience. And, it's this carnival ride, at least, for me, it's this absolute, flash, 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 clicking the viewfinder as fast as you can. And, like that's the fishing for ideas. But for Lynch's, the idea is that you go deeper and deeper. But again, like you start to move into poetic imagery, and there's like depth isn't necessarily a very helpful way of describing that process. That's why daydreaming is so difficult in this paper. Like, like the way that Freud's trying to relate this experience of daydreaming to a creative act, I still think there's a lot of problems here, which, like it's Freud, which means that every time he's working through an idea, he's basically working through it on paper, exposing himself. He's totally open to being erroneous. He wants to have conflict. He knows that he can have addendums later. Like that's one of the great parts about him as a thinker. But again, like what is it about the phenomenon of daydreaming that separates it from something else? Because people talk about it as shower thoughts. That's a very common way of talking about daydreaming. Like that's an accepted way of talking about daydreaming.
Yeah, I know. Yeah.
I know, like I'm a delivery driver for work, and like at a certain point, learning how to drive a car when you're using gears, that's very troublesome when you're learning. And then once you start driving, that's an unconscious act. But I can be driving 110 kilometers an hour with full traffic around me, and I am in a totally mystical place. I could be looking out the side window, no awareness of traffic, but I'm having the grandest time intellectually. And that, that's my daydreaming.
Yeah. Is it the kind of like connection, like problematic since Freud thinks that the daydreaming that we experience is egoic. It's just serving our own selfish ego. And in this, Freud is saying that when we start to reveal, what is Freud doing? He's listening constantly to people revealing their innermost, filthiest secrets, and he is recognizing the fact that the way that our spontaneous fantasies present, they are something that's not really presentable to others. They are things to be ashamed of, in a sense. And what the creative writer has to do is to somehow overcome this. And when I've personally tingled with the idea of being like a creative writer, Freud is absolutely right. The very most difficult thing is to just retain a sense of like that it has some kind of like original quality to it, but also that it's not your own ego that you are trying to satisfy in there. And Freud says that how the writer accomplishes this is his innermost secret. The essential ars poetica lies in the technique of overcoming the feeling of repulsion in us, which is undoubtedly connected with the barriers that rise between each single ego and others.
Yeah, what does it mean, that passage? It's so obscure, that passage, right? What does it mean? I didn't.
Yeah, I think it's really simple, but when you are trying to make a creative work, it has to be of value to others, but it also has to be of value to yourself. There's a conflict here.
I think I would like to add something here, since Mika mentioned the other. Freud writes that we behave like a creative writer, write the world of our own. So in that sense, fantasy is subjective. It's subjective because it also includes fiction. But Zizek claims that fantasy is at the same time an ontological scandal, because it shatters, dissolves the duality of subjective and objective. Because I think, yes, it is subjective because there's a fiction created by me, but at the same time it is objective because there is always the other in my fantasy. So this is a thing I wonder, actually, because regarding the desire, in Lacanian sense, they say that the desire is always the desire of the other. So we inherent the desires of our parents, family, society, and so on. So this is the thing I wonder, what do we actually inherent to form our fantasies as well, because fantasies also involve the other as well. And so this is the part that I find a little bit interesting. I couldn't find more literature review on it. Yeah.
Yeah, I think that for me, this statement of repulsion, you know, this overcoming the inner repulsion, is really where you could get the emergence of something objectively new. Because if you don't overcome the inner repulsion, then by definition, you're only going to be in sort of shallow subjective images. Personal, not deep, but kind of shadows of the core or the real. And at the same time, to really, as Evren's saying here, to shatter the coordinates of the subjective and the objective, you have to sort of own this and go into it in a way that transmutates it. And I think that Freud points towards this in this paper as well. I don't think he would disagree with that. The interesting artist, because everyone brought up an artist that, like David Lynch or James Joyce. The artist I would want to bring up for further reflection on this topic is Francis Bacon, who definitely went into the real of and definitely tried to transmutate something very dark about himself personally, but also something objective about what it means to be a subject. And so I think that this is worth thinking about, and also the way in which I recommend Alenka Zupancic lecture on Francis Bacon, because she did a good job of bringing out the way in which contingency and necessity operate in art, and the way in which something, as it were, in the artist's own motion is spontaneous, but at the same time appears as if it had to happen. Like as if it's an objective necessity, a contingency that is objectively necessary. You know, and I think that this would emerge even for someone like you, Birdie, in your daydreaming while you're in the truck. Like that you're purely daydreaming, lost in your fantasy world, but that something emerges in the logic of the fantasy world that somehow represents something objectively necessary. I don't know. Like...
Absolutely. And I'm so with you on that, Cadell, because like I watched a documentary on Francis Bacon 2 days ago. So this is fresh in my mind.
Yeah.
And I had the Zupancic lecture sitting there today, and I was like, should I?
Oh, you got it.
Yeah.
I'm in, man. I'm in. I think that like to risk a connection for a moment, the relationship between these two papers is basically like a relationship between almost like the living experience. So a dream is the mind's intestinal excess, right? So if I'm trying to do a homology between dreams and shit. So if dreams are the mind's kind of intestinal excess, so in daydreams, you are trying to hold on to the shit that we've talked about before. So we have a lower level of repression, and in the creative act is something that comes about by being able to, with the lack of or the lessening of a sensor, hold on to an idea, like an unconscious idea or like a libidinally enthused idea. And then you have on the other side, just the unconscious process of an idea. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I would say that perhaps one could ontologically speak of like illusion here, about what is the kind of like illusion of fantasy. What's the illusion that we need to overcome for the kind of like ordinary way of ideology criticism in fantasy. And fantasy in itself, when you think about it, it just becomes this like a groove, or the kind of way that our psyche sort of spontaneously organizes itself around some kind of like point, or some kind of like obstacle, one could say, perhaps. But if we think of like well, I would say the kind of like really commonplace figure of somebody who perhaps experiences mental illness or some kind of like really big troubles, and perhaps the most creative persons and the greatest artists are in some sense insane, and they have to be. And when they try to sort of like overcome their own like limitations and their own troubles in trying to describe their own like how they experience, it's, I think, the kind of illusion or the naivety that needs to be overcome is that there is some figure of the other who is going to be receiving it, or it's usually this case of like somebody trying to really explain what they're going through. There needs to be this kind of like illusion of the other at somewhere who is the recipient of the message. And we always are working in this way when we are trying to like formulate some kind of like creative art. It has to have some kind of like point of reference
for someone. It needs to be for someone.
But also it's really
like
tempting to think that we need to explain it ourselves to some kind of like bigger other figure who is going to justify our existence for us, since there is no bigger other.
Exactly. And at the same time, we operate under some kind of faith that the letter will always arrive at its destination. Like the the function of fantasy is in this sense, is the netting beneath the the wire artist who walks along the line. Like the fantasy is there to function as form.
That's really great, and I think that the kind of the thing that I am quite repulsed by, since there are things that we could perhaps be justifiably repulsed in our like creative culture. It's this sense where somebody is seeking for some kind of like revenge or seeking for a satisfaction by revealing the kind of like mistreatments how they experienced. And now we are, I mean, somebody could like be celebrated as a really great writer when they write about their own personal autobiographical like experience, and then we hooray, yeah, they're giving us some kind of like justice for their misfortunes. There is no such thing as like repayment for all the we are in a sense infantile if we expect some bigger other to grant us some sort of like reward after we have overcome all our troubles. And
absolutely,
this is the story that I see many times as like really like people celebrate about the person who finally was able to justify existence to herself, something like that.
I think
my the candid account of my victimhood of circumstance.
Yeah.
It's and the enjoyment in it, the thrill of my own ego.
I just want to say before closing that to sort of reference what Bertie was saying about we operate under some faith that the letter will always arrive at its destination. I don't know if any of you guys are aware, but on David Lynch's YouTube channel, every day he has a box of numbers, all random numbers, and he goes into the box and he says, "What will be today's number?" And he just picks out a number at random. He picks out a number purely at random and then shows you the number, and he's like, "Today's number is 7."
Oh
and then
God.
the video just ends.
Yes.
Yeah,
and it's the perfect representation of there is no big other, but at the same time, today's number is 7.
Yes.
It's like, but you know what the mythological people would do? They would say that there was some big other that needed it to be 7. Like that's the equivalent of astrology. Like that the reason why this happened was because Saturn was in this position in the sky. Or
yeah. And Jung was, as Freud says, Jung was seeking for like lawlessness inside of us, like pure contingency within us, and there is just pure order outside of us, whereas Freud is focusing on the order within us, in a sense, and not outside of us. I mean, Freud perhaps thinks that external reality is, in a sense, contingent, and
yeah. Okay, guys. So
perfect.
If there's a theme between these two papers, I think, which has already been previously brought up, I think we can find it in sort of all of the strange ways in which sublimation can produce our both our character, our relationship to feelings of, the mind is not disconnected from influence of these libidinal excitations. It's constituted by them. It's deeply in relationship with them. Our character is a work of sublimation in some sense. This ongoing tension, bringing it deeper and deeper into conscious awareness, being bold, brave, developing the courage to explore ourselves, and that the creative writer is one modality of many potential modalities to explore our artistic, our creative potentiality, and that situating our creative potentiality in the libidinal body and its desires and its tensions is a way to sort of escape the kind of people who talk about creative potentiality as if it just comes out of, I don't know, nothing in like a disembodied sense, or have naive romantic fantasies about it. So I think that when we push to these deeper limits, we all in our own way pointed towards figures who went very deep into themselves, like a David Lynch, like a Francis Bacon, like a Picasso, like a James Joyce, and so forth. So very interesting session. I thank you guys all for your presence. This was really enjoyable for me. I will put out another link in just under 2 weeks' time for the next session. And I hope to see all of you there. Thank you guys so much.
Yeah, thank you. It was really, really great discussion. Thank you, Freud, for this, and thank you, Cadel, also.
Thank you.
All right. Have a great day, guys.
Bye.